So without any further ado, we'll let you roll with it, Sarah.
Right, sounds good. Thanks so much, Craig. My name is Sarah Crooke, and I am the owner of Crooke Ag Consulting. So I'm a TSP in Pennsylvania as well as New Jersey, focusing a lot with nutrient management and conservation planning. Um, on my own, we farm over here, and then I have a small meat goat herd that I'm learning as I go along, mostly just trying to keep them alive, pretty much. Um, but so I'm glad to hear that there's a mixed bag, maybe some small ruminants on this call. And as livestock producers, we're all really in tuned with what we're feeding our animals, whether it's through the supplements or feed rations, whatever that might be. But the question is, are we as in tuned to feeding our pastures and our hay fields? Are we paying attention to making sure that they're meeting their best yields and potential? So then in return, they can support whatever livestock we are raising. So, kind of an outline of where we're going to head in today's presentation is the overall importance of soil fertility, how to pull a soil test, and then interpreting those results. So soil fertility, I put one slide for this, which you can talk a whole lesson on soil fertility, but it is in my opinion, the first and the most important when it comes to producing good quality crops, whether that's pastures, hay fields, because it's the framework, it's the foundation. You can't expect to control your buttercups in your pastures or to have great yields if you're not paying attention to what's happening below the soil surface. So, along with that is really maintaining. I'm going to minimize this because kind of, there we go. Sorry. Maintaining a balanced diet, which is essential to meeting your yield goals and also to making sure we're not having any negative environmental impact over applying certain nutrients, especially when it comes to phosphorus, as that is a big play in surface water. Good soil fertility is essential in battling weeds as well as disease management. I'll go on a farm and I'll use buttercups again. And they'll say, I don't know what I'm doing. I have all these buttercups. I can't control them. I'm mowing them. I'm mowing them. Most times when we go and pull that soil test, it's very acidic. The pH is a 5. So that's again kind of is our first framework to solving our problems, as well as disease. Soils that are hungry for the appropriate nutrients that they need are more susceptible for disease. Their overall vigor, winter hardiness can all be stressed. And the first step to really uncovering what's going on below our pastures and below our hay fields is pulling a soil test. Um, Not sure how many of you guys have pulled soil tests on your own. If you have, great. If you haven't, now's a good time to learn and to begin. It's not challenging at all. I think the first step is determining your lab. Consistency is key. So, and what I mean by that is if you're going to choose to use Rutgers or Penn State or Spectrum, is to stick with that lab because all labs test a little bit differently, and you don't want to add more variables to an already very variable situation. So, removing those variables by keeping the same lab as well as sampling in the same time of the year. There's not huge swings, but there can be slight swings if you were to rotate, meaning one year you'd sampled in the winter and the other year you sampled in the summer. Just try to keep the time consistent. There's not a right or wrong season, but keeping it consistent is key. Step number two is collecting your sample, deciding whether or not you're going to sample composite versus grid. In most pasture situations, composite makes the most sense. If it was a corn or soybean field that had a large variability of soil types within that field, or you notice yield variation within that field, then setting up 1 acre grids throughout that entire field is something I would recommend that kind of pulls out any anomalies that you might be picking up, and then you can treat that anomalies separately as opposed to commingling them. So if you say you have a 10-acre pasture, say it's a perfect square, right, in an ideal world, I would pull about 20 cores, walk randomly, whether it's a W or a Z, just a random pattern throughout that field, pulling about 6 inches deep, kind of where the bulk of the root mass is. It's important when you're pulling those sample or pulling those cores to, if there's an area where there's no grass growing, or there's an area where a whole lot of thistle is in a certain patch, to kind of avoid pulling the sample from that area. Maybe sample it completely separate in its own bag. That way, if that is an anomaly of the field, you're not contaminating your entire sample. You then mix your cores in a bucket and you pour about 1 cup of that soil into the sample bag. Fill out the necessary paperwork that's associated with the lab that you're working with. You mail and then wait for results. When choosing a lab, I also would say it's important to ask what their turnaround time is, depending on the urgency, can kind of hinge on which lab you're going to use. For instance, some labs are much quicker turning around than others. When the results come in, regardless of which lab you use, you can really break them down into 3 sections, and that's below optimum, optimum, or above optimum. And obviously, below optimum meat would essentially mean that there's not enough nutrients there to produce the quality and yields that you're hoping for. So we're going to need to apply more fertilizer to meet, or more manure or compost or any form of organic matter to meet our yield goals. You're obviously going to see the most response and ROI by applying any amendments in the below optimum. The optimum range is the ideal range that we want to be in and maintain it in that. So that is telling us that our soil test levels are adequate for our crop needs. And we basically, to maintain into the optimum range, want to just apply enough nutrients that the crop that meets the crop's removal needs, if that makes sense. And then the third would be the above optimum, which signals we are in excess of whatever nutrient that might be. So in most cases, when we are in the above optimum, we can dock or dial down how much nutrients we are applying. In some cases, we can pull the plug altogether where we have enough nutrients to meet our crop needs for that year, or in some cases, several years. Kind of flipping back to the variation within labs, there's many different variations. One would be display, and we're going to see that in a little bit. How they use their bar charts. Is it all just numbers? And maybe you find the numbers overwhelming and you like the preferred bar charts. That's all kind of things to look at. Also, the phosphorus extraction method. Most of the local labs in the Pennsylvania and New Jersey area use what's called the Mahalic, oh my goodness, I'm blanking here. The Mahalic 3, sorry, extraction. And that is, in terms of a regulatory perspective, at least in Pennsylvania, the soil tests have to use that extraction method. So all of like Waypoint, Rutgers, Penn State, Spectrum, they all use that same extraction method. If you were to pull a lab from, say, the Midwest, they might use a Bray, which isn't right or wrong. It's just kind of hard to compare when you're looking at local soil. So I strongly advise sticking with local labs. And lastly is the units of how they measure the nutrients in your soil. So they, for instance, Penn State will use a parts per million and Rutgers will use pounds. So that will, and we'll see that as we move forward in the presentation. And again, no right or wrong. It's just pay attention to the units. And this chart right here shows how you can convert from one to the other. So here's an example of a spectrum result, and this is just one soil sample on here. So they broke it down with the soil pH, And then we have organic matter, our CECs, base saturation, and then we move down to our macros and micros. And then they add a nice chart because everybody learns differently. So sometimes charts you can look at it real quickly and be like, okay, I'm good. Or in this instance, no, we're not. We're pretty deficient on both P and K. This can be cumbersome if you are sampling 20 plus fields, right? To have 20 different sheets to look and compare from field. So they also have it or a nice layout where you can look at all of your fields on one sheet. It makes analyzing them much quicker because I can say, okay, where are my manure priorities? This is a terrible example because manure priority would be on all these fields because phosphorus is really low. But say if there was variation, I could say, all right, where is my lowest fields? Where do I need to take my next loads of manure to? And this is much, for me, much easier to look at than the picture here on the left. Two more. Here's Rutgers. Again, they have a nice combination of the bars to make it more visually appeasing, if you will. And then Waypoint has a bit of both with the bars. And then I cut it off, but they have their base saturation and ratios over to the right. So the two that we're going to look at today is the spectrum and the top is spectrum and the bottom is a result from Rutgers. So I kind of copied, if I flip back, here's the full page of the Rutgers, but I just snipped what the pH piece is because that's what we're going to talk on for these next few slides is two factors that have the most influence in nutrient availability, and that would be the pH right here and the CEC. So another thing to note when choosing labs is what is all included in their base soil sampling package. As I was going through Rutgers, I realized they didn't have a CEC, and I'm going to talk about a little bit of CEC, but where Spectrum, that's included in their base package. So first is pH, and that's the optimum range is between 6 and 7, and it's a key player in nutrient availability. If you look to your right, you'll see this chart of all the different nutrients that a plant needs. And then at the bottom is the scale from acidic all the way to basic. So you'll see between 6 and 7 are the optimum ranges because that's when most of these nutrients are the most available to any given crop. Certain crops, for instance, alfalfa, need it closer to 7, where some other crops like pure grass stands, they can tolerate it below a little bit below 6. So kind of depending, or like blueberries, obviously much more acidic soil. So depending on what your crop is, we can move on this scale a little bit one way or the other. And then also looking at the roots below is the first right here on the left, we have our adequate pH range, and we can see how good the roots are compared to this middle line where we're at 5.2. And what loves acidic soils are weeds. So that's usually a big indicator to me when I'm out on a farm and I'm looking at pastures. I'll throw the equine community here under the bus. But I see it the most with them where their pastures are loaded with name your weed, especially the annual weeds. And sure enough, when we pull a soil test, it's usually around a 5.5 or a 5.3. So weeds love a bit more of an acidic soil. So again, maintaining adequate pH is going to be in favor of what the crops that were our desirable crops need. And that's why routine soil testing is important. It's also extremely important if we are in a no-till situation or a continued forage situation that we're not letting our pH drop below 6. Because since we're not having any incorporation through machinery of tillage, we're not mixing a limey material as frequently, if at all. So what'll happen if we need to put a lot of lime down and we put that on the top of the soil, we're kind of only neutralizing that top 2 inches, where obviously the roots grow much longer than the top 2 inches. So neutralizing this top layer is not really beneficial, and we can have what's called an acid roof. So in continued forages or any no-till situations, we really need to be on top of our pH and make sure it's not dropping below 6 so that we can apply small amounts of lime on an as need be basis as opposed to large slugs. So lime is what is the amendment we would use to raise our pH. And when purchasing lime, we would want to make sure we're focusing on the CCE, which is the calcium carbonate equivalent, not to be confused with the CEC, which we'll talk about next. And that's basically the pureness of the lime. So all lime recommendations are given in 100% CCE recommendation. So if you were to get lime from a plant down in Lancaster, it might be the cheapest lime, but it might have a CCE of, say, 80%. So, yes, while it's cheap and that is enticing, we now need to apply more product because we have to offset that it's only 80%. So, at the end of the day, it might not be the cheapest product. And then fineness. So, the finer the material it is, the quicker it's going to neutralize and raise our pH. Where if it's more of a rock-like, it's going to take a longer time overall. So then cation exchange capacity, and this is the negative charge on soil particles that can hold positively charged ions or cations. Okay, so what does that mean? I like to think of the CEC is the soil's parking lot. And what I mean by that is the parking lot of the number of parking spaces that your soil has. So each parking space is your soil's ability to hold on to nutrients. So if you have fewer parking spaces in the parking lot, right, that means you have fewer attachments to hold on to the nutrients. Where if you have more parking spaces, that means you have more options or more availability for the nutrients to hang on to your soil profile. So what does that mean? That basically is how we manage our soils. So a soil with a CEC of 20 can hold on to nutrients much longer than a soil with a CEC of 9. So most of the soils in this part of the world have a CEC flirting around, say, 8 to 12. And that just means we have to manage our soils differently. We can't put everything on all at once and expect it to be there, especially when it comes to nitrogen throughout the entire growing season. We then are tasked with a more management approach of a little bit over the course of the time over a period. So individuals who are down in South Jersey, where they're dealing with more sand, I back up, sorry. CECs of 10 or low indicates a more sandier soil, so a lighter soil. So individuals down in South Jersey, they have a CEC of around 5. So how they manage their nitrogen is a very much a spoon feed. Otherwise, if they were to put all their nitrogen up front, say in a corn crop situation, by the time we come to grain fill, we're going to have very little to N available to fill out those ears. So it's really just the management of how do we apply our nutrients. CEC and organic matter go hand in hand. As our organic matter increases, so does our CEC. But those of you who are paying attention to your soil's organic matter and trying to improve it by continued cover crop, manure application, or keeping it in a forage, constant forage, realize that that is a very long and slow game. So don't lose hope. It's not just you. That's kind of how the soils behave. It's a slow process to build your organic matter.
And
So kind of going
Sarah,
back. Oh, go ahead.
Larry had just commented in the chat on the lime. He said before extracted lime, folks used wood ash, and nowadays people act like it's the craziest thing you can do. Do any of you use this? If so, with what results? And I don't know if you have any comments towards that. We can maybe get into that later towards the end of the presentation as well.
Yeah, I don't have any comments on the wood ash. I know people have asked me on that in past, and I don't have any good information to say one way or the other. What I would recommend, as with all recommendations, if you were to apply it, is to test it, to test your soil, obviously, before, and then test your soil maybe the following year. If not, definitely another 2 years and keep a trend. Otherwise, you're not really tracking if it's working in the favor you want it to, or if it's kind of leading you down a rabbit hole that you don't want to go in, if that makes sense. Um, so here we're comparing the the pH levels. So you'll see on the spectrum, we'll see that the soil pH and the buffer pH. So the soil pH is an actual measurement of your soil's acidity, and the buffer pH is a test run by the lab. So it's not testing your soil, but it's testing the availability of acidity from that might be released in the coming years. So kind of futuristic, if you will, approach. So if these numbers, because it's helping us decide how much lime needs to be applied. If the soil pH and the buffer pH numbers are close together, that's telling us that we're going to need to apply more lime to see any movement on the spectrum. So in this case, by the soil lab spectrum, we have a 6.8 and a 7.1. So they're pretty close together. So we would have to apply a lot of lime to move our soil pH up a little bit. And for this farm instance, I'm not recommending applying any pH because we're in really good shape at a 6.8. Now, if we look down to the Rutgers result, our pH is a 5.3, where Rutgers calls it the lime requirement index, but it's essentially also known as the buffer pH. That is a 7.2. So that's a much greater gap. So that's telling me if we put 2 tons to the acre of lime on this field, we're going to see a much more drastic response, which is good because with a lime of 5.3, we want a drastic response because we want our soils to be up between 6 and 7. And then CEC for the first guy. So that's letting us know that we have a relatively sandy soil. So how I would look at that is we need to apply nitrogen in a very cautious way so that we're not losing it to the environment, but also that we're not throwing money away. So in a corn crop situation, definitely side dress nitrogen. Otherwise, if we put it all up front, the chances of us getting it at grain fill is not going to be there, especially if we have a really wet spring. All right, so, I'm kind of jumping ahead here a little bit, but when deciding what type of liming products to look at, whether it's magnesium-based or calcium-based, I will then refer to what our magnesium levels are. And I'm gonna kind of spoke ahead a little bit as we'll revisit that later. So the next is we're going to talk about the macro, and that's a mistake in my slide. It shouldn't say micro, it should say macronutrients of the big three, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So if you see here, we don't have nitrogen tested. And that's because nitrogen is very dynamic. So if we were to test nitrogen with a fall soil sample, the nitrogen that we would have availability in the spring is most likely going to be completely different. So nitrogen recommendations are typically based off of what our expected or proposed yield goals are, where phosphorus and potassium, obviously, there's soil tests for them because they're not as volatile as nitrogen. So as seen in this chart, it is very volatile. It can be lost out into the atmosphere. It can be through heat, and it can be lost into the ground through leaching with a lot of rain. It can be lost in a million different ways. So a slow feed, especially with low CEC soils, is definitely recommended. And kind of the yield goals, as you'll see this carried out for all of the nutrients. If your goal is 3 tons of hay, then we would need 150 pounds to the acre. And obviously, we wouldn't put that all up front in a pasture or a hay situation. I would put about 50 pounds of that before first cutting, basically at green up, and the remaining applications would occur after the first cutting and then after the second cutting, or however many cuttings you plan on making. So phosphorus, the ideal soil range is between 30 and 50 parts per million. And And 1 ton of hay removes 15 pounds to the acre of P2O5. So it's mobile in the plant, so you'll start to see the deficiency. I know this is a corn plant, but it's hard to see it as expressed like this on in grass fields. But it's the same as the purpling. Honestly, if you're in a hay field now, as with these warmer days, maybe we didn't have enough warmer days, but you might start to see some of the purpling on your plants. That doesn't mean you have a phosphorus deficiency. As the temperatures are cold, P isn't as available for the plants to uptake it. So it's first expressed as this purpling deficiency, but as we move more into warmer conditions, it becomes released and the plants are able to take it up. So don't, unless you have an actual soil test, if you were just out doing a great pasture walk or a hay field and you were seeing that, don't stress, especially if it's in a cooler time of the year, say early spring or late fall. The concern we have with phosphorus when we're in excess levels is more from an environmental perspective, especially or thankfully it's primarily lost through soil erosion. So it's stable, unlike its counterpart nitrogen. So if we had in a pasture case, for instance, that was severely overgrazed and we had a lot of bare ground, we have weather like we're having today with rainfall, that sediment is moved and attached with that sediment is phosphorus. And once phosphorus gets into surface water, we have the algae blooms and water quality is degraded. So this is definitely a nutrient that we want to make sure our soil is staying in place and we're not experiencing any erosion. The last of the macros is potassium. So the optimum soil range is 100 to 150. And honestly, I think we can kind of extend that optimum range to over 150, especially if we're talking about forages, any corn silage or small grain silage, where we are removing the entire crop. We really want to be closer to 150, or we will see definitely some yield loss. 1 ton of grass hay removes 50 pounds of K2O. Potassium, I like to say, is the dark horse of the macros because everybody always thinks about nitrogen, but in our forage crops, especially our grass hays, potassium is extremely important for yield, as well as keeping our plants healthy, having good winter hardiness, overall plant vigor from a grazing perspective, that return to the height we want it to be. If we are deficient in K, we probably will see a slow response after our cattle or small ruminants are done grazing. And when we have our extreme weather patterns that we do in the winter, or sorry, in the spring, of excess rain and then going back to no rain at all, having adequate levels of potassium definitely helps as a buffer because it's a water soluble nutrient. So if we were already deficient in potassium, if we were to hit a drought, our plants are going to struggle that much more. Where if they are in the optimum range, they're still going to struggle, but they're going to be able to stay in the game a little bit longer. And I've seen this in hay fields a lot. They tend to peter out much quicker when our potassium levels are low. And something to watch out for. It's a luxury nutrient in the forage crops. Just like I'll eat an entire gallon of ice cream in one sitting. Do I need that? Absolutely no. But because I love ice cream, I'll keep eating it. Our grasses really respond the same way. So again, splitting our applications of potassium is important. So whether you do a little bit in the spring and then say the remainder, say 1/3 in the spring and then 2/3 in late summer, before basically that plant goes into dormancy, will also help with its overall winter hardiness.
And Sarah, another question. Does encapsulated nitrogen release more slowly and is therefore better in low CEC soil, or just does it just help prevent volatilization? We get our hay nitrogen treated with nitrate.
Yes, so absolutely. Getting whether regardless of what it's getting treated with, is having a slow release N is always beneficial. I would just recommend fully knowing what the encapsulated nitrogen is, meaning there's some products that are going to prevent against volatility, and there's some products that are going to prevent against leaching. So leaching, any product that's going to help against leaching is going to be really, I would say, critical in the spring, which is like right now, right? Because we're getting a lot of rain. So my concern for nitrogen is leaching into the ground, but then flip towards as we move towards June. So after that first cutting, I don't really have concerns of nitrogen leaching into the surface or leaching into the ground. I have more concerns of it volatilizing, so going up into the atmosphere because of the heat. And since we're not incorporating that nitrogen. So absolutely having treated N, I would say is critical, especially if we're not incorporating it. So in a hayfield, right, we're not incorporating it, and we're not always so blessed to have rain after application. My watch out would just be make sure we're getting it treated for protecting it for the right means of loss, if that makes sense. And there's so many different products depending if you're buying it from Growmark or TMAC or CPS. Sorry, that's now Nutrient, but just ask your sales rep so they can kind of help you in the right direction on that. So looking at these soil tests, the first one, the field K12-1, our phosphorus levels are 118 parts per million, and our potassium levels are 267 parts per million. So phosphorus, we're in really good shape. In this instance, I would not recommend any additional fertilizer for P. It would be a low priority for manure application where we're at with those levels. Potassium is kind of a question to this producer is if he's growing a lot of corn silage and he wants good yields, we might just offset the removal rate. But if this is a hay field and we're taking our goal is 3 tons, we're in pretty good shape. And this is kind of where the conversation goes is how much money do you have allotted for fertilizer? And this year, fertilizer prices are going to be a little bit scary potentially. So maybe this is a year we can back off because we're in really good shape. I'm going to meet my crop yields based on where I'm at. Jumping down to the Rutgers test. So this is phosphorus at 102. Now remember, these are in pounds per acre, not parts per million. So if we want to convert these to parts per million, we would need to divide both phosphorus and potassium by 2. So just to keep my math simple, okay, say our phosphorus is 100, divide that by 2, phosphorus, divide that by 2, we would be at 50 parts per million for P. And for potassium, divide that by 2 to say we're at 99 parts per million for K. So we're right on the money for phosphorus. We're a little bit low for potassium. My recommendation in this instance is phosphorus is just offset that removal, whether that's with the manure application, or having it or commercial fertilizer. And for potassium, while we can maintain it at 100, it's still on the lower side, saying this is in forages. So I would account for the crop removal, which is 150 pounds, right, of a 3 ton to the acre. And then I would add a little bit more if we can financially afford that, just to slowly build up those levels over time.
Another question. What are your thoughts on a biology first approach versus a chemistry first approach to improving soils? The advancing eco agriculture peeps seem to focus on products that boost microbial metabolites and the nutrient delivery capacity of mycorrhizal fungi instead of soluble synthetic fertilizer. Thoughts?
Yeah, so if I heard that is the question of biologicals, does that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, Oh, this is a tough one. So biologicals, everybody has one today. It's definitely the new hot trend. The question is how well they work, right? And how do we test for that? I'm a big believer in manure. So get your compost, get your whether it's bed pack manure or a leaf compost, and use that first, and then try the biologicals, but have your checks to say, hey, this is working or this isn't working. But the the part with the biologicals is they're very much dependent on, from my understanding, on the weather. So if we had a drought, which we've had the last few years, I wouldn't see our biologicals working as well because we're not getting the rainfall and our temperatures are kind of all over the place. Where if we have a normal year, which what's a normal year anymore, I would I would assume that our biologicals would be working really well. Or on the flip side, if we are in heavy amounts of rain and throughout the entire growing season and our soils are completely saturated, asking the question again, then how well are biologicals working? So that's my take on bio. I'm not saying anything negative against them or anything positive. I wonder how do we check them for actually working? Because I'm always leery of snake oils. Um, and then also their success hinging on the weather. So how do we really check how well they're working? That didn't answer your question. I do apologize. That was a very political response. Just because I can't really give you a yes or no. But that's why I always love, right, using manures, using your organic compost because you're getting much more than just NP and K. Where if you're using commercial synthetic fertilizers, that's all you're getting. Where with a compost, you're getting all of the good bugs, you're increasing organic matter, and it's at the end of the day improving your micro activity. I hope I didn't confuse you. I can't see your faces to know if I completely confused you on that.
I think that's good. And Kate, feel free to unmute and ask anything further or type in the chat box. But I think we're good. Thanks.
Okay, good deal. Um, so moving forward to our secondary nutrients. So that's magnesium and calcium. And there's one more that's sulfur, but from a basic soil test lab, sulfur isn't included. That would be a full, complete test. But in this one, sulfur was not tested. So I kind of pulled sulfur off of this competition. Um, so here we have our magnesium and calcium levels for both the spectrum test as well as the Rutgers test. So I recognize there is a lot on this screen. Um, but there's ranges between magnesium and calcium, and I kind of the most efficient way for adjusting these two levels is through liming. And when our pH is off, usually one of these two are also off. So when I look at pH, I then usually jump to, okay, which level was low? Is it magnesium or is it calcium? And if our magnesium level is low, then I'm going to lime with a magnesium-based lime. If my magnesium levels are in check, but my calcium is low, then I'm going to lime with a calcium-based limestone. So that's kind of how we manage these two. But if our pH is in check, usually these two are in check as well. And then base saturation, which I didn't, that's, again, the Rutgers test didn't show the base saturation. So just another thing to kind of think about when you're choosing labs. But the base saturation is right here on the spectrum. And what that is telling us is that is the measurement of potassium, calcium, and magnesium, the percentages of those on the CEC. So how much is that being held onto our soil profile? So when we in the Rutgers lab that was submitted, I found really interesting because if we remember, the pH was really low, but when I now look at the magnesium and calcium levels, they're both above optimum. So I'm kind of confused as like what's going on. And so then when I went to say, okay, what is the base saturation telling me? Didn't have a base saturation, so I don't really know what it's telling me. But if there was a base saturation, say for the Rutgers, and it would hopefully would tell us that we were deficient or lower on the magnesium level or the calcium. So that's saying while it's in the soil, it's not adhere to where the plant can uptake it. And maybe that's why we're seeing a lower pH. But again, these are all in ranges. I use the base saturation to really kind of check where we are, basically just another tool. So if my potassium levels are well into the optimum, above optimum ranges, but my base saturation isn't within range, then I'm still going to apply more potash because obviously it's in the soil, but it's not, for whatever which reason, on the CEC. So the plants aren't able to uptake it.
Another question. Can you run through sulfur levels that are beneficial for hay and pasture quickly after magnesium and calcium?
Yep.
Some of us might be deficient and don't know how much to apply.
So sulfur is, especially if you have manure out there, typically you're not going to be deficient because the manure is putting them out. But ranges for like pastures and hay fields, we want about a 10 to 30 pounds to the acre is what we're looking for. It's very similar to nitrogen, not as volatile, but it can be lost. A lot of times I'll see corn. I know most of you guys are probably hay and pasture guys, but the deficiencies are much easier to see in cornfields. So I use that a lot as an example. So in a cornfield, I'll see a sulfur deficiency starting at the top of the whorl when it's colder. So it's a kind of a streaking between the veins. But as soon as it starts to warm up, it'll bounce back out and it'll turn to its normal healthy green. So as we get warmer temperatures and our soils begin to mineralize, it'll release that sulfur. And that's kind of where sulfur test on a soil test can be somewhat misleading because it'll change a little bit similar to nitrogen, just not as drastic. But to answer your question, it's about 10 to 30 pounds to the acre for forage grasses and pastures.
Great. And then another question, can gypsum be applied in such cases where calcium is above optimum, but pH is low to increase the bioavailability of the locked calcium?
Yes. So sulfur, just to kind of run you through this, sulfur will lower the pH, but gypsum will not lower the pH, but it will help bring up our calcium levels. So, as I said that, did I answer the question?
I think so. Diane, feel free to um, add anything else. We're good. Thanks.
Okay. Oh, I jumped ahead here. So this is kind of all levels on both of these soil tests are in check. So obviously the first lab or the first soil test is K12. No liming material is recommended. The test from Rutgers, the pH was really low, but both your magnesium and calcium are in good range. So when liming, my recommendation would be to choose the liming product that is in terms of magnesium versus calcium, choose whichever one is cheaper, depending on locations or what you can get. Sometimes magnesium lime is cheaper, sometimes calcium lime is cheaper. So there's no right or wrong for this particular case because your levels are all good. Just kind of in wrapping up some overall end goals is one, I would say get started. I feel a lot of people, you're like, oh, I'm just going to keep doing the same thing that I've been doing. It seems to be working. I put out so many pounds of nitrogen and I put out my potash. I'm in good shape. My forage just looked good. Um, Definitely get started. Even if things look good, your pastures looks good, and your hayfields, go out and pull a soil test because one, you could be over applying, and with today's prices, we don't want to be spending more money than we need to be spending. Also, we could be overfeeding one pasture and underfeeding another pasture. So we want to make sure that everybody is getting fed equally in terms of we're focusing on fields that need it and then kind of reducing nutrients on a pasture that maybe doesn't need it so much. Keep records. What we do when we take a soil test is really a snapshot of that given time of year for that particular field. Keep records of what you applied, how much you applied, what the weather was like, and then pull the soil test again another 2, 3 years. And what do we like to see is trend lines based on our management saying, hey, we're doing X, Y, and Z, but we're seeing a drastic negative change in that. So that's changed something. Or we're seeing a positive change. Okay, good. What we're doing is working. Let's keep doing what we're doing. Or if we want to see a change, but yet we're not seeing a change, then let's reevaluate what else is going on. So by keeping records, it's allowing us to ask more questions and to have hopefully some answers to those questions. And utilize your manure as a resource. I hate when people say, "Oh, waste storage facility." I like to just say manure storage facility because manure is not a waste. It is a resource. Utilize it as the goal that it is. Um, I know this is kind of a brand new topic, and you're not supposed to do that at the end of a presentation, but in terms of fertilizer, use it as it is as a resource and not as a waste. So pick your pastures and hay fields that need it, and don't just spread closest to the barn. And with that, thank you. And are there any questions? Hopefully, I didn't put anybody to sleep or confuse anybody too much.
Yeah, we do have another question. And for everyone, feel free now to unmute and ask questions or continue adding to the chat box. But regarding manure, any comments on adding gypsum in barn during use? It's said to stabilize nitrogen by creating ammonium sulfate, as well as being beneficial in bedding.
Yeah, I don't have anything negative or any watch outs on that. I have a customer now that's using gypsum in their bedding. Um, And my opinion and advice to him is make sure you're routinely taking samples of your manure. So take yearly samples of your manure and then maybe move to a more frequent soil testing. Again, keeping the trend lines. If you're saying, hey, since we started using gypsum, we're seeing our soils get really out of balance or moving in a direction we don't want them to. But if you're not pulling your soil test, and kind of watching your manure analysis, we're really shooting in the dark of what could be happening or what's going on. Because we don't always see the results. I guess my opinion is I don't want to see a negative impact as like if we're seeing it by the eye, it's probably too late. We want to be catching it in a soil test before we're catching it with our eye, if that makes sense. So I don't have any watch outs or any concerns. If it's working from a bedding perspective, keep doing it. I would just recommend adding to a more routine soil testing program.
And she did say, it sounds like she soil tests. She said Penn State soil tests give sulfur levels. Ours are usually a bit below optimal, also copper and
Okay.
zinc.
Okay. So yeah, the gypsum should definitely then be hopefully beneficial. Are you seeing them go up with the gypsum or you haven't been using it long enough to see a change?
Diane, feel free to unmute. And Sarah, I'll let you know if she gets back to that.
Okay.
Yes. So in the past, when this is because they're always not too bad, but they're a little below optimal. Growmark always uses ammonium sulfate when fertilizing our fields. That said, I haven't used artificial fertilizer for a while because we have manure that we spread, and we actually, our stocking and grass growth is such that we don't really need to increase the amount of grass. And I have noticed if you add salt, I have even used Dispersol, which is mixed with urea. You have to be careful because you can burn the grass with Dispersol. However, it really greens up nicely. I mean, it seems to me pretty obvious. We need sulfur.
Yeah, and I would also pay attention to the time of the year too. If you're seeing in the early spring where it's cooler, I wouldn't be so alarmed just because those microbes are beginning to wake up. Now, if we've been having warm stretches and it still looks anemically green, then yes, definitely a sulfur is needed. I hear that a lot with corn guys being like, why does my corn look so pale? And it's usually those colder, wet springs, and the sulfur just isn't yet available for the plant to uptake. But as soon as we get those sunny, warm days and those microbes are waking up, it'll change pretty quickly. So pay attention to the timing of the year with that as well as when you're seeing it, the anemic Kelly green colors.
So you mean pay attention to the time of the year rather than to the soil analysis? Because if the soil is always low, surely it's low.
Yeah, and that's true, but also take it a little bit with a grain of salt. With that sulfur it's not as volatile as nitrogen, but it's still volatile. So when you pull the soil sample, it could be adequate, but then during the shipping process, you could have lost some of it.
Okay, thanks.
And Sarah, how long does it usually take for gypsum to react? Can it be applied and tested in a few months, or should it wait at least a year?
I would wait at least a year just to give so you're not getting anxiety from those 2 weeks in case it's a slow process from Mother Nature and weather and whatnot.
Yeah, it looks like we might be all set, Sarah. So I think with that, I'd love to give Sarah a big thank you for sharing her time and knowledge with all of us. Yeah, I really, I feel like I learned a lot myself and really appreciated it. So thank you.
Thank you guys.